Okay, so a couple spoiler alerts here. I like to think big picture, and then these are topics that will like go into much more depth. Pun intended again, I guess. So just like that river continuum concept, we're going to talk about things in this paper all semester long, but I just wanted to kind of take a big picture look first. So these are some of the themes. Like, I don't know, if I run into you, and we're sampling invertebrates in a stream 10 years from now, like these might be ideas that would still be in your head potentially from stream ecology. So one of them we'll see over and over is that the stream is affected by its watershed. When you look at what's going on in the watershed, you can predict what will be going on in the stream. And as we talked the other day, right, the idea that like what leaves our body like sort of carries a signature of what is in our body. The same way the water that leaves a watershed carries a signature of everything going on in that watershed. So, of course, if we have a forested watershed versus one that's had a lot of urban development going on, these streams are going to look very different and function very differently. Because you might have noticed in the river continuum concept paper, they pulled out that term natural a few times. This is how natural rivers and streams work. Now, what happens when this goes on? That's a whole other conversation. But maybe the RCC can inform our prediction. Yes, and then the RCC itself. I don't know what people taught when they taught stream ecology in '79 before this paper came out in 1980, because it does an amazing job of laying out what you would expect to see as you move from the headwaters of a stream into the downstream reaches. And we'll revisit this this figure in our paper discussion. But the bottom line is we're going to see very different organisms and very different ecosystem processes up in the headwaters versus downstream. And Vinod et al.'s whole argument is that that's kind of predictable, again, in a natural stream. I may do that every time I say natural. Because is there any part of the globe that hasn't been impacted at all by humans? Certainly the degree varies, but with climate change, you can argue that like all of the globe has been affected to at least some degree. So this idea that we have these predictable changes along the length of a river or stream, and that affects the energy availability, the rates of different ecosystem processes, and as a result of that, it affects the invertebrates that we find. Of course, the fishes that we find, it all comes back to the fishes. Well, no, although they do eat the invertebrates. No, but some invertebrates eat fish. I suppose they do. And then the third kind of big picture theme I just wanted to have on our radar is how important the flow regime is in a river or stream. This is an aerial photo of the Mississippi River at two different two years with very different discharge for that year as far as volume goes. You know, it's crazy to think that like the amount of habitat you have if you're an aquatic critter can vary exponentially from one day to the next, depending on how much it rains, you know? And so it's a very different life after the big rainstorm than it is the day before the big rainstorm. So rivers and streams are dynamic ecosystems. Vinod et al. Talk about this idea of dynamic equilibrium, right? There's a lot going on. A lot of what we've learned in ecology about succession, the effects of disturbance on communities, we can relate to communities like rivers and streams or intertidal communities, communities that experience a lot of variation. Now you can argue that soil microarthropods, meadow and forest plant species, you can argue that they experience disturbance, and I will agree with you on that. But the degree of variability that we see in river and stream ecosystems just on a day-to-day basis is crazy. And so thinking about particularly how much water is in these rivers and when is a critical piece to understanding how they work. So we'll want to keep that in mind as well and realize that the answer to our question, whatever it is about stream ecology, may depend on how long it's been since that area is flooded or had a drought. Yeah, like these insects and birds and stuff, like they don't have to worry about like running out of air, right? Well, maybe in some, no, they don't. But if you're like a fish and you get like a severe drought, like we had my first year in Asheville, like you might not even have enough water to survive with oxygen in it, right? Whereas most terrestrial critters, like you gotta worry about a lot of things, but at least having enough air to breathe is probably not one of them. So this whole idea of like just how incredibly dynamic rivers and streams are is another common theme. All right, so as I mentioned, sorry, this is what I wanted to mention. I'm sorry. It's like something a young kid would say. I'm sorry. I was going to touch on this now, right? So the idea is like, how do we, meet our species need for water, because we need water, just like the stuff in the stream too. The stuff in the stream do. It's good I'm wearing this mask, so you can't figure out all the things I'm saying that are grammatically incorrect, which is, I guess, a good thing. I don't know. So, right, how then are we going to reconcile like creating habitat and dynamics for all these species that live in rivers and streams with the fact that we're also a species that needs water, right? We need water. Also, yeah, we need water, and that's what's led to these 5 different things. I can't talk today at all. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say that whenever I screw something up from now on. I'm sorry. Cool. So then, thinking of like managing rivers and streams and how do we do that? It's a balance, because we know that we're going to need clean water. We know that we're going to go fishing in these streams. We know that agricultural development is going to affect them, urban development, everything. But how do we do that in a way that these factors, that we sort of like minimize the effects of these factors? Okay. So I want to talk today specifically about that gradient from the headwaters to the downstream reaches of a stream. And so we now have this idea of the river continuum in our vocabulary. And so fluvial just has to do with flowing water, essentially, right? So we're just talking about, and primarily like the physical aspects of flowing water. So I want to talk a little bit about like the physical processes of flow and how they affect these ecosystems kind of along the length of the stream. So to give a bit of context, here are the watersheds of the 2 streams where we're going to be working. This is Bee Tree Creek. To kind of orient you here, we've got Swannanoa and I-40, Highway 70 down here. So our site is, so Bee Tree Creek. How many of y'all have been to Craggy Gardens? I think I might have asked that the other day. Yeah, so that's the upstream bound of the Bee Tree Creek watershed. And then it flows through the Asheville watershed and the Bee Tree Reservoir. We've got, North Fork Reservoir over here. That's a lot of forest going on. It's only when the creek gets way down near where we're going to sample it that we start to see some development here, some urban development. All right, this is Sweeten Creek. And so essentially the upstream boundary of both these watersheds is the Blue Ridge Parkway. So just to rewind, this is the Blue Ridge Parkway, and water flows down from that. Same thing with Bee Tree Creek. That's the upstream boundary of the watershed. And right in here, Biltmore Village, is where we sampled it. So, let's see, in this area in here. So it's a very different landscape, right? There's very little forested area in the Sweeten Creek watershed. So as it's flowing down toward its mouth, we can just think about how these things that Vinoda I'll talk about might not work so much in this watershed. So the RCC, as stream ecologists lovingly refer to it. Basically, the concept proposes that understanding of the biological strategies and dynamics of river systems requires consideration of the gradient of physical factors forming the river network. So once we understand the physical gradients here, then we'll be able to understand the biological piece of it. So one of the important factors there is erosion and deposition. So we know about how old are the Appalachian Mountains? Give or take 6 months. No, just kidding. Old, that's correct. They're at least 15 years old. Oh, 50 million years. Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny. Whenever I ask like Dr. Jack or Dr. Jeff these questions, like it's a long conversation. They're like, well, depends on how you measure it. Some people say that they should have actually eroded away by now. But one estimate that's out there is about 500 million years. That's a widely cited estimate. Okay, so over that 500 million years, uplifting is going on, orogeny. We have mountain ranges forming, and then at the same time, of course, they're eroding. So if this is our watershed, or moving from upstream to downstream, just to figure out of your book, there are these two processes of erosion and deposition. And so upstream in our headwaters, we've got fairly high flow velocities, steep gradients, lots of erosive power of the water. And so it's moving that sediment downstream. And then, of course, as that material moves downstream, the landscape kind of starts to level out. What happens to the flow velocity of our water as the land starts to level out? It's going to slow down. And then what happens to its ability to transport sediment as it slows down? Decreases, so it's going to drop out, exactly. So there's this net process of erosion in the headwaters and deposition downstream. So thinking of our site at Sweeten Creek on Tuesday as a downstream site, did we see a fair amount of fine particulates, fine sediments in the substrate there? See a couple nodding heads. Where was it most prominent? What parts of the stream? Yeah, in the pools. Now, interestingly enough, where did we seem to collect the most invertebrates? In the riffles, in those higher flow velocity areas, right? So, yeah, so as all this sediment settles out downstream, a lot of the times that's not going to be great habitat. But so we've got this net movement of sediment from upstream to downstream. I will track down some data. When I was in Nepal, the mountains there are so much younger, and the rates of erosion are so much higher. It's crazy just how much erosional material is deposited every year. It's incredible. It's hard living in a Himalayan stream just because you've got so much stuff coming down at you. So there's this net movement of sediment and erosional material from upstream to the downstream end. So just to give an example, anybody know how to say the name of this river? It's pronounced Arkansas. I don't know why. But then it makes you wonder why Arkansas is Arkansas and Kansas isn't Kansas. This is what keeps me awake at night. Can you see? This is what happens. So they pronounce it Arkansas River. I don't know why. No way. Who won? No. Is there a reason? Please let me know if there's a reason. I see no reason, and that keeps me awake at night. Okay. No way. The floor is yours. No. Really? Well, see, okay. Have you heard people talk about this river? Because when I was in Oklahoma, they still called it the Arkansas River. Were they just screwing it up? You know what Will Rogers said? He said that when people moved from Oklahoma to Kansas for the gold rush, it increased the overall IQ of both areas. Yeah, anyway. Okay. Anyway, whatever. And I never go off on tangents, as you can see, which is a good thing. So anyway, the river starts to, it's kind of like Leicester and Leicester. How's it pronounced? Lysa. All right. Anyway, the river that shall remain nameless. Don't say the name of this river, or it will realize where you are and might come and mess with you. So this river arises in in the Rockies. And it looks like this, right? So large substrate, high flow velocity, right, which removes all the substrate particles except the larger one. We call this a sediment evacuating part of a river, right? So it's going to be clean, moving those fine particulate matter downstream. This is what it looks like in Oklahoma. A little bit different, just a little bit different. So all of that sediment that's coming out of the Rockies is deposited down here. And so we call this sediment accumulating. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. I think it's Tonkawa. I think I heard it pronounced that way. So this is one big difference, right? Is just this gradient of erosion versus deposition, and that results in different substrate sizes on the river. And we saw just over the course of a couple hundred meters what a big difference that can make for the life in that stream, right? Because just compared to the riffle and pool, we saw a big difference. Now imagine over the scale of hundreds of miles, something that looks like this. This isn't going to be a good place to live if you're an invertebrate. On the other hand, upstream there's going to be a lot going on. All right, now does anybody remember what section of the river continuum contains the most species? The middle, good. So it's the middle section. And to answer the question, why are there most species in the middle section, a good way to go about that is to ask the question, why are there few species in the upstream and downstream areas? So this is a picture of a little headwater stream like we have around here. This is actually in McDowell County, I believe. We were doing a project over there. We've got some rhododendrons here. It's a little hard to see, but got some boulders, pretty good sized rocks there. And the stuff that lives here, this is one of my former research students, Lily Dancy Jones, with a small brook trout, the only trout species native to the U.S. East of the Rockies. But what is it about streams like this that make it hard to live? Why do we have low species diversity in the headwater sections? So cold, temperature will have a role. High flow rate, yeah, it could be difficult to live if it's moving really fast. And if we think, so both of those are true. Although remember, there are some species that can live just fine in the cold, like trout and stoneflies, for instance, we find in cold waters. And high flow rate can make it hard to live in some cases, but remember our riffles, right? And to some extent, it's nice to have flow because it keeps our larger rocks cleaned off. So those can be important, but they wouldn't necessarily cause our species number to be super, super low. What else might be going on up here? Say that again. Lack of sediment buildup. So thinking that sediment is like a good thing for species. So it'd definitely be true that species that need sediment couldn't live here. But as a whole, we generally have more species that don't like sediment than that like sediment. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. But a couple things that the RCC has to say is light, which kind of relates to temperature in a way. But when light is low, why is that a bad thing for species living there? Can't grow, right? So plants our plant production is going to be low. So it's going to be less to eat. If you're a grazer in cold waters with low light, what we call periphyton, we'll talk about that later, essentially plants that grow on the surface of things, the rate of growth of those is going to be very low. So the base of our food web is going to be small. Temperature, in the sense that it's going to relate to productivity, is going to limit some things. And then this other part, when we talk about where we find the most species, I don't know if you talk about this in ecology, but we'll talk about it more. But the principle of competitive exclusion, right? What's the principle of competitive exclusion? Anybody remember? Yeah, exactly. So it says that two species can't occupy the same niche, which involves competing over resources indefinitely. So it follows that the more niches you have, the more species you'll have. And so there's just not a whole lot of different kinds of habitat here. So this is going on. We've got low productivity, low temperature, which is, it will connect to productivity, and then low habitat diversity as well. So this is going on in the headwaters. What about in these downstream areas? What might limit the number of species in a place like the Arkansas River at Tonkawa? What might keep species diversity there low? Yeah, sediment is going to be the big thing. So again, not a whole lot of habitat diversity, because if it's all that sandy, silty bottom, there's, you know, you're limited as far as what can live there. And the question, like, why is sediment a bad thing for invertebrates, really relates to this, habitat stability. Now we've got a few invertebrates that can live in the sediment. We have some mayflies and things that burrow, and they make little tunnels. Wow, so many pens. Oh, that was starting to work. No, it's just that's weird. Someone needs to throw these things away. Maybe that someone should be me. Yeah, probably. I don't know. I don't know why they're sitting here. It makes it look like we have 1,000,001 pens when in fact we have 0. Oh, there we go. We have 1. So like if this is the bottom of this stream, there are some mayflies that dig a tunnel that goes like this in the bottom of the stream. And they have, this is their little mayfly head, and they have gills all the way along their abdomen here. And one thing they do is they're filter feeders. They have filter apparatus actually around their mouths, and they siphon the water through this way and out that way, and they filter out all the little particles of food, and they eat them. So you can do that in sediment, but what you can't do on sediment is, say, graze algae off the top of it, because algae doesn't grow real well on sediment. It's not stable enough. Anyone know any other invertebrates that are able to live in sediment? So the other one, and they're not insects, right? But the other big one are freshwater mussels. And so they do a similar thing. They use their muscular foot to burrow down into the sediment. And then they have siphons. This is not an alien freshwater mussel. That they suck water in, blow it back out. And they're filter feeders as well. So this is a freshwater mussel, in case you couldn't tell. This is a burrowing mayfly. And so some of these things can live in sediment, but many more of our invertebrates aren't able to do that. Right. So filter feeders, like, they get hit really hard with pollution because they're sucking all the water in and filtering it out. Exactly. And so freshwater mussels, they're not real good at moving around. And so when you have a lot of sediment coming in, they can get buried. As well as when you have pollutants in the water, they take them up at really high rates because they filter things in, and then they filter them out, and then they can incorporate them into their tissue. So yeah, I'm here shared with y'all. So freshwater mussels are arguably the most imperiled group of species, of aquatic species, and for a bunch of reasons. But yeah, number one, you're sessile, so you can't move. Number two, you're a filter feeder, so anything in there that's bad, you're going to end up sucking up and incorporating in your tissue. All right, so just to illustrate that, here's an example. And, you know, I'll share the way that I teach, and some of y'all know this, is I like to use examples from scientific studies. And when I do that, like, you don't have to write down all the details of that study. Just kind of, like, be aware of the take-home message. you'll be allowed to take it home. So this is a study on the Satilla River. I don't know what it is today in pronunciations. I pronounced it Satia when I first was using this example, and somebody in my class is like, actually it's Satilla. We go there every summer. I'm like, all right. So the Satilla River looks a lot like this, right? Lots of fine substrate. It's down low in the watershed, so got a lot of sand, a lot of sediment. So these authors looked at where invertebrate biomass was. And it was almost entirely on what they call snags. So these are like what they call large woody debris. Anybody know how long it takes like a trunk of a tree to decompose in a stream, river stream? I have no reason at all to suspect that you would know that. I just, was asking because maybe you've been studying it recently. I don't know. So hundreds of years is how long it takes like the trunk of a tree to decompose. So these are very stable substrates. So if you're an invertebrate and you need a hard place to hang on, this is a good place. So these snags were less than 4% of the habitat, but over 60% of all the biomass is there. So it just shows how much stability of substrates can limit a river or stream's ability. And of course, that's the food web, right? Because as we'll learn later, almost all secondary producers, secondary consumers, consume invertebrates. I talked to you about how there are some fishes that feed on drifting invertebrates, the ones that have the mouth out at the end of their head. And so a lot of invertebrates drift naturally or behaviorally, and most of those are coming off of these snags here. So, all right. So when we're in the middle of the river continuum, and an example of this, French Broad River near Weaverville, right? It's wide. There's lots of light coming in, right? So we've got lots of light coming in. That allows our producers to go crazy, and so that allows our grazers then to do well. A lot of habitat diversity generally. If you've explored the French Broad River, for instance, you'll see some areas where sediment accumulates, right, behind maybe a boulder. A little patch of habitat there. But then you got other areas where the water is really flowing swiftly along, and so that's something habitat for another species. So we've got lots of habitat diversity. We're going to have variability in temperature. It'll change season to season. This is going to be cooling water over here, and if water collects there, that could actually be a cooler spot in the river. Out here, it's going to be warmer. And another reason that we find more species in the middle, if you imagine that we have a suite of species that do great in the lower sections of the river, another suite of species that do great in the headwater sections of a river, their ranges could likely overlap in the middle sections of the river. So you also have that going on. The Goldilocks hypothesis, if you will. Right? This is an area where species adapted to the lower sections of the river might find a pocket of slow flow and find substrate to hang out. And species adapted for the upstream sections of the river that like higher flow, larger substrate, they'll probably also find a place to hang out. So again, this high habitat diversity plays a role in determining which species are where. Next time you're exploring a stream, just look around at how many different kinds of habitat are available. And it'll be interesting for us. So in our lab, we're going to take measurements of water flow, depth, substrate size. And so we'll be able to quantify habitat diversity at our two different sites. So as you're thinking about what causes there to be differences in number of species, it might be something to think about. Now, there can be other factors that could limit things too, but something to think about. All right. So with this longer class period, I like when I can to give folks a 5-minute break. Um, I don't think it's going to work real great to have us all rushing out of the room. But if a couple people need to and we can do that staying 6 feet apart, I'm totally cool with that. So I like to take just a little break between kind of the lecture component and then our paper discussion. So let's take about 5 minutes and do whatever you need to do in the next 5 minutes to be ready to roll again. I'm excited, you guys. This is our first celebration of the semester. Pretty pumped. What'd you look up? So I know people that have done research on that river that call it the Arkansas River. I kid you not. They may just be pronouncing it wrong. I don't know. Really? Yeah, Olivia getting pretty animated there. She's kind of looking out the door, like, are the police coming? Like, I know how they are in Arkansas. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Okay. Well, good. I have become educated. I sorry. But there's also a fish called the Arkansas River Shiner, which is endangered, interestingly enough. It so the Arkansas River, so it flows like kind of southeast, and then so you've got the Illinois, you've got the Grand River in that area. I think the Arkansas River connects kind of in like the middle part of Oklahoma where it hits. What's the boundary? Is Arkansas the boundary on that side? Is Arkansas directly east of Oklahoma? I'm trying to think, because of course you got Kansas, Oklahoma, then you got Missouri over here, and I guess Arkansas. Yeah. Okay. This is a long way of saying I'm not sure, Olivia. Um, yeah. There's a lake called Grand Lake. So there's the Grand River flows into Grand Lake, and it's kind of sad. So the name is Grand Lake o' the Cherokees, and it was literally like short for Grand Lake over the Cherokees because when they built it, it like covered over a lot of native land, which of course Cherokees had moved west from this part of the country before that. So yeah, we did a research project there. We resampled a bunch of sites that were sampled 60 years before to see what species had declined and stuff. That's kind of interesting. Interesting place to explore. A lot of rivers out there look like rivers here, which you wouldn't think of, because Arkansas River looks like a sandbox, but there are kind of clean, neat rivers with large substrate too, kind of like our Mills River and that kind of thing. So, all right. Oh, I got to pull my summary up here. All right, well, I guess we'll go ahead and dive into our paper discussion, shall we? We'll see how many cheesy aquatic analogies or puns we can use. So again, this is the idea of this paper, right? That we need to understand the physical structure and the hydrologic cycle to be able to figure out what's going on with biological responses and what we find in our stream. And so this idea of it connecting very closely to energy, right? To energy storage and processing. So I just wanted to go over a couple terms which you may have come across in the paper. The first is stream order. How many of y'all have heard of stream order before? A few folks. Okay, cool. Well, stream order is just a way of classifying the size of a stream section based on the size of the tributaries that feed into it. So the way it works is you start at the very headwaters at the smallest, what we call perennial stream. What do you think we mean by a perennial stream? Always flowing, right? So we'll find some real small streams that don't flow year-round. But the smallest perennial streams that flow year-round, all right, we start with those, we give them a number 1. Those are what we call first-order streams. Okay, and then we just work our way downstream. And where 2 first-order streams connect, it becomes second-order. And where 2 second-order streams connect, it becomes third-order. Now, no matter how many streams of smaller order connect with the stream, it doesn't increase in order. So our third-order stream here, when another second-order stream flows into it, it stays third-order. It only increases in order when it meets a stream of the same size, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a rough measure because you could have a second-order stream that has only 2 tributaries flowing into it, or you could have a second-order stream that has 53 first-order tributaries flowing into it. So it's a rough measure, but it just tells you where you are in the network position. This idea of autotrophic versus heterotrophic, what do we mean by autotrophic in like an ecosystem sense? Yeah, it produces its own energy, and what we would say is that it produces more energy than it consumes. So with organisms, it's simpler. You're an autotroph if you make your own food. You're a heterotroph if you got to go get your own food. But with ecosystems, they're autotrophic if they produce more energy than they consume. They're heterotrophic if it's the opposite. They consume more energy than they produce. How is it possible for a stream to consume more energy than it produces? How is that possible? Exactly, because of input from outside of the system. So all these little photosynthesis machines that you see hanging off of the trees right now, the green ones, they're all going to fall here before too long. A lot of them will get washed into the streams, and then that's that energy input. Okay, so we can talk about autotrophic versus heterotrophic. And the final is functional groups. It talks a fair amount about this with invertebrates. And this is just the idea that, well, MC, would you like to say a word or two about functional groups? And the only person in our class who's taken aquatic macroinvertebrates. So I'm just curious if you guys talked about that in that class, kind of what. Yeah. So you're saying pictures worth 1,000 words, so we should just, yeah, okay. Yeah, so the idea is we can categorize really anything, but mostly we talk about invertebrates based on their role in the ecosystem. So we can talk about grazer invertebrates, all different species that are, of course, consuming the autotrophs. We can talk about collectors. You might have seen some shows on Netflix about them. Hoarders is another way to think about them. No, collectors. But they collect all kinds of things. But they collect them and eat them is what they do, which most hoarders don't, I don't think. So collectors are these invertebrates that are like cruising around collecting organic matter. They're like, is this? No, I've got that already. This? Oh, beautiful. Bring this back home. Sorry. So they're invertebrates that are like collecting like organic matter and consuming it. We also have shredders. You often see them skateboarding. Man, they can like on the rail grinding. They can rock it. They're shredders. But when they're not out on their boards, they are in streams consuming leaves, breaking down organic matter, shredding it, if you will, breaking it into tiny pieces, some of which they eat, some of which they're collectors. Like, whoa, man, they really shredded that one. I'm going to keep this piece. So there's like these shredders shred the leaves, move downstream, collectors and other folks get them. And then, of course, predators, you know what those are. Again, this is like the lion or the tiger of the aquatic realm. So the idea is like what these things need to consume, right? The availability will differ along the length of the stream. Yeah, I love this. This is an in-color version of that picture that was in your article. I love this. Like, you could teach a whole class on just this picture. We should just, like every class, we should just look at this picture for like 10 minutes, and then decide what we want to talk about. So yeah, this pretty amazing. It's got everything, you guys. It's got invertebrates. It's got fish. It's got energy input. It's got it doesn't have the photosynthesis to respiration ratio, which the original figure does. So what sections of the river are autotrophic? If we look, like, let's just break it down like upstream, middle, downstream. What section is autotrophic? So relatively speaking, downstream. But if we go too far downstream, so yeah, let's just kind of take it through, because everything you guys said was correct, just based on context. So when we're up here in the headwaters, it's heterotrophic because you don't have a lot of photosynthesis going on the headwaters, right? It's shaded. The water's cold. The water's cold. It's shaded. Yeah, so you don't have a lot of photosynthesis. On the other hand, up here, do you think a river is most tightly connected to its forest, to its valley? You think it's more tightly connected upstream or downstream? Well, you guys had a 50-50 shot. Yeah, it's upstream. And think of it this way. Just look at like the surface area to volume ratio. Like the surface area of a stream compared to its volume. Not a whole lot of water in the headwaters, but trees overhanging it, things coming in, right? So we got all these leaves washing into our stream. As those leaves are broken down, that's providing energy. It's providing a lot more energy than our poor little algae are here in this shaded area. So we're heterotrophic in the upstream regions because there's not much photosynthesis going on, and there's lots of organic matter coming and getting broken down. In the middle, downstream of the headwaters, is where we have more photosynthesis. So the canopy opens up, the sun is able to get into the stream more, which gives us higher rates of photosynthesis. And then relatively speaking, we have less input. But really, it's the increase in photosynthesis as the canopy opens up. But remember we talked about sediment. So as we get downstream, again, more or less sediment downstream. More. And sediment is not only bad for invertebrates to hang out on, it's bad for algae to hang out on. Because they like stability. Like a lot of us, like for stability in their lives. Sand, sediment, is not stable. It's moving around all the time. So we don't have really great autotrophic production further downstream. There's not good stuff to grow on. Plus, this water's deeper. The water's murkier. So that light isn't able to penetrate down to the bottom of the stream very well. And even when it does, we don't have a great substrate for algae to grow on. So our photosynthetic production down here is pretty low. Plus, what's going to happen to all that organic matter that's getting shredded and broken down? It's going to keep flowing downstream, and it's going to accumulate down here. And then it's going to get broken down, right? That dynamic equilibrium. If there's energy, something's going to use it. So down here, we're going to have bacteria, fungi, all the same decomposers we have on land. They're breaking it all down here on the bottom of the stream. They are going to need oxygen to do that. So they're going to be burning up oxygen, respiring, and we're not going to have a whole lot of photosynthesis just because the water's murky, it's deep, there's sediment instead of nice flat rocks. So then when we get down to the bottom again, the downstream sections, again, it's not heterotrophic. The community here is not so reliant on energy from the sun coming in. It's more reliant on energy that's been flowing downstream. The pieces and parts of these leaves, we'll talk about this later, but the poop of the invertebrates that eat these leaves, all that stuff is washing downstream. So, so because of that, you have things down here like these catfishes, right, which are consuming organic matter that's been produced elsewhere but is just there. We don't have so many grazers. And if we're way downstream, someplace like the Mississippi River, we start to see some plankton, some phytoplankton. What's phytoplankton? What is it? What does it do? Exactly. Yeah. So phyto is referring to plant, and plankton just means it floats in the water. So yeah. Again, now so these are the some cases the single-celled plants that float in the water, and so if we have a real slow-flowing river, we could get some of those developing. But you can't have plankton up here, man, because they get washed downstream. So only down to the bottom. Questions or thoughts on this? It's basically our whole class. We'll have more to talk about it. Right. Right. And realize this is like a concept. You won't be out in the stream and see a sign now entering autotrophic area. Like it's a gradient, right? It's but that's kind of the way that it shakes out conceptually. Cool. All right, so let me go ahead and pull up just my little article summary. So see what that looks like. So so this is what I'd like you to prepare when it's your day in the sun. You, like an autotroph, will have your day in the sun to produce as if, sorry, I'm going to stop. So yeah, so your name, the date, I got that right. Otherwise, I'm sorry. You've got the citation of the article here, the whole citation. We've got the list of authors and year, the title, then the name of the journal, and then like volume and page number, right? And then a short little summary. This summary is maybe a little shorter than you need. I don't know, just because this was a very synthetic article. Like if the paper you're leading discussion on was more like an experiment someone did, you might go into a little detail about their methods and stuff. There weren't really any methods for this paper, so this is kind of on the short side. Then we've got some questions at the end. So I would give a short summary of this paper, and I ask that you not read your summary word for word because we already have that. And I want this mostly to be a discussion. So unlike I'm doing right now, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time like lecture talking because we've all read the paper already, we've got your summary. So I just say something like, the river continuum concept is a conceptual framework to explain differences in structure and function of lotic ecosystems along their length from headwaters to lower sections. And if you want to, you can say something about it assumes a dynamic equilibrium based on use of available energy or something like that. And then I might say, any questions or general comments about this paper? Anything that you read it and you're just like, what were they thinking? They're like those people that call it the Arkansas River. They just, don't be afraid to feel that way about a paper. If you read something and it doesn't make sense, that maybe because it doesn't really make sense. So any questions or general comments? overall impressions as you read it? Yeah, Olivia. Yeah. So yes is the short answer. But so let me ask y'all, maybe just kind of keeping like Sweeten Creek in mind. Um, can you think of some ways? Like, did anything come to mind that would happen that might affect that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And so I wonder. So let's take a prediction of the RCC. Let's say, what about this prediction that the downstream sections are, have more respiration than photosynthesis? Now, I think they were really thinking of places like the Mississippi, downstream areas of the French Broad. But can we think of a way that like pollution runoff might affect the balance between respiration and photosynthesis? Can anybody think of a way that might? Okay, yeah. So if we've got increased nutrients, how might that play a role? Or photosynthesis, right? Yeah, exactly. So nutrients. Yeah, maybe if we've got a whole lot of nutrients coming in, uh, we have relatively more photosynthesis than we'd expect, which could certainly be the case. Yeah, other ways? Darcy and then James. Yeah, interesting idea. So maybe that leads to like, yeah, there being a lot less oxygen. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and that's really one of the assumptions behind this paper is that when there's available energy, it'll be consumed, right? And so, yeah, and so when those species are excluded for some reason, then that could very much be the case. And for your first paper, I'll share with you an article that it looks at different families of invertebrates and classifies them based on their pollution tolerance. And so if you look at that, and there are a lot of grazers that aren't pollution tolerant, and they start to drop out of the system, then yeah, that could certainly lead to there being more food left on the table, so to speak. Um, right? Yeah, so it doesn't talk at all in that like breakdown of functional groups of invertebrates about tolerance of various species. So if we start to eliminate pieces of those functional groups based on their tolerance, then we might expect that ecosystem to function differently, potentially. Um, Other thoughts? I love the way y'all are thinking about this. I think these are all interesting ideas. What's another prediction we could think about? So there's a balance of photosynthesis to respiration. Let's see. Um, yeah, there's this. So I guess if we think of the whole watershed, maybe. Uh, and by the way, I realize we're kind of focusing in on question number 4 here, and that's okay with your discussion. If there's a question that the class really seems to be into, like the main goal is just to get us talking about it. So, if that's like leading to more questions and people seem interested, like that's totally cool. Like you don't have to. It's good to have a few questions ready, but if one question people kind of get into, like just go with that. That's fine. But thinking about this idea of like, input of leaves and organic matter in the upstream section, and then that being processed on the way down, becoming what we call FPOM, or fine particulate organic matter. I don't know, how might that gradient, because these upstream sections are kind of urbanized too. I mean, just looking at that watershed, like, can we think of a way that maybe the upstream sections might be different from what Vanode et al. Are thinking about? Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. So maybe the processing efficiency is decreased, right? Yeah, maybe we don't see as much of it getting broken down. Absolutely. What about the input of, as they say, CPOM? And we'll talk about that later, right? Coarse particulate organic matter, which, by the way, is anything bigger than about a millimeter is considered CPOM. So, like, a piece of a leaf up to like a tree is CPOM. They do, yeah. And so it happens a couple ways. So one of the ways it happens is by just kind of breaking it down. The other way is like literally like as they eat it, they don't digest all of it, and so the waste is FPOM. And you know they don't digest the leaves really well, so there's still like nutrients like in that waste too. Any other thoughts? I guess I'm just thinking about like the input of. Yeah, for sure. And I was, yeah, right. So logging, and I was thinking even if these are suburban areas, like, yeah, maybe there's a lot less trees that are just cleared to build houses or something. Yeah, so there might just be a lot less trees in the upstream area, which might lead to less energy input, you know, and all the way down. When my major professor, when I was doing my PhD out in Oklahoma, talked about how this was done with eastern streams in mind, where we have large deciduous forests in the headwaters. But for instance, in the Midwest, it's grasslands, right? You don't have enough precipitation to support large forests. So what does it look like when you've got grasslands in your headwaters? So certainly the type of energy coming in looks different. You know, maybe these numbers switch out. What does it look like when you've got, maybe you've got a greenway, but maybe it's still a tiny little strip of trees along your stream, but a lot less than you would have. So yeah, see, you know, think about how that looks. I think we kind of talked about this so far. So just be thinking about this, right? Sometimes there's a scientist will quote is, sometimes in science, it's more important for ideas to be interesting than it is for them to be true. So this river continuum concept might not really apply to our streams. We can certainly think of why it wouldn't apply to Sweeten Creek, but you know, Beetree Creek too, there's a big lake in the middle of the watershed. You know, so sometimes these ideas are useful as what we call straw men. So it's a hypothesis that someone has, it's pretty easy to knock down. But when we think about the reasons that it doesn't fit, we can learn a lot about the systems that we're studying, right? So you can take this as kind of like maybe how in some ways rivers should theoretically work. And then we can look at how, when they don't work that way, why that is. And that's interesting to learn about, you know, how humans affect ecosystems and what the majority of our rivers and streams actually look like.